fuel does that potentially add to that discontent fire when you also might look at your retirement or whatever portfolio you have and see that number going down?
I would expect that this is actually probably going to have some downward pressure on President Trump's approval ratings with respect to the economy. They've been underwater for most of the polls that have been taken since he started his office or a second term of office. And so I wouldn't expect for those to change. Now, President Trump has actually tried to turn the tide. He's been attempting to inoculate the public, saying brace for some tough times, brace for some instability in the economy now. And so what he's hoping is that he can maintain his base by telling them that it's going to be bad at first, but in the long term, it's going to be better. And so I think the big question is, will his supporters stick with him in the long term? And will they be willing to ride out this tough period? And I think the bigger question than that is actually how long will this rough period be? And will people have the patience to be able to get through it?
Well, if this market reaction continues and prices rise, the Democrats just win the midterms?
It certainly helps them, but they're going to have a good message. They're going to have quality candidates, and they're going to have an effective mobilization strategy. So those were deficits during the 2024 cycle. It was very difficult. Vice President Kamala Harris put forward a laudable effort to put something together in a really short period of time, but there were deficits there, and I think Democrats are still trying to figure out what that message is. But terrible economic data certainly doesn't help the incumbent party.
Well, so when we consider the incumbent party and Republicans who would want to try to hold on to the majorities in both chambers in 2026, how could they need to distance themselves from these policies of the administration? Because by and large, Andra, we're not seeing many breaks within the Republican Party suggesting they don't agree with this use of tariffs.
Well, I mean, I think what would remain to be seen is whether or not Republican legislators would, in that instance, put the interests of their constituents or even their own self-interest ahead of their political interests. So there are a lot of Republicans who sometimes quietly speak out against some of the policies of President Trump and his administration, both in the first and in the current administration. But if they're concerned about a primary challenge or if they're concerned that Donald Trump might attempt to badmouth them or endorse their opponent, that they won't speak up in an election. If President Trump proves to be unpopular, what we may start to see is some Republicans become emboldened in terms of how they speak out against the president. But what we've seen time and time again is that even when we've seen bursts of people kind of dissenting openly, usually they kind of come back in line shortly thereafter.
How much time does President Trump have then? Professor, the reciprocal tariffs don't go into effect until April 9th. Presumably, some of those may not take effect if the White House starts to cut new trade deals and start to find reciprocity in our trade agreements with those countries. Let's say the markets like the sound of that. We get back to a better place as we walk into the summer period. Then reconciliation happens. We start dealing with Trump tax cuts. Could this turn around politically?
I mean, I think it is possible for it to turn around. I think you outlined two different scenarios here. So the first scenario is how long will people put up with, I guess, the instability that could be caused by tariffs, at least in the short term and possibly even into the medium term. And the short answer to that question is that I don't know. And I think we just have to wait and see how patient people are. I think the other issue is the spin. So we have seen President Trump, announce tariffs and then sometimes pull them back. And so that's certainly sort of wreaks its own instability on markets as people aren't quite sure what to expect. But what it also does is it creates an environment where it's actually really hard to keep up with what he's doing. And so in some instances, Trump may not be doing anything, but it looks like he's doing something, and he might be getting credit for at least trying to change the status quo. And so I think the question is, what are the underlying reasons for people choosing to stick with Trump or choosing to oppose Trump, and whether or not they're actually able to keep up with just the flurry of announcements that are coming out related to the economy from the Trump administration.
Well, and it's really mostly coming from the president himself, Andra. Does anyone else, if the tariff scenario doesn't work out in the way he's hoping it will, with just a revival in manufacturing, not too much in terms of increased costs for American consumers, barring that, is anyone else ultimately going to be blamed for these policies when he has been so vocal in his advocacy for them?
Well, I mean, so this is the one policy that Donald Trump has been consistent on for most of his adult life. So this isn't just a policy tenet of Donald Trump, the politician that we've known for the last 10 years. This is something that he's been advocating for since the 1980s, at least. And so one of the things that we think about in terms of kind of policy feedback is how effective is a particular policy. So President Trump is actually taking a big gamble by going against conventional wisdom and using protectionist policies to try to grow the U.S. economy. It could either succeed wildly or it could fail spectacularly. And so if it fails spectacularly, I'm sure he's going to try to come up with an explanation to try to massage the hurt and the pain. But I think the question is whether or not the American public will actually buy that.